I am the great Tasty Nades, and also joining us today, the infamous Big White Angus.
Good afternoon, BlueBall Reviews lovers and followers. I am the great Tasty Nades.
And I am the Big White Angus, recently shaved. We've had a heat wave come through and it was definitely time to lose all the fur. So today we're going to be talking about the history of video games. Specifically today we'll be talking about the history of video game consoles. Later on we'll be creating a series of videos talking about different aspects of the history of video games. Today, again, it'll be specifically for consoles. So we'll start off way back in the early days. Back before my time.
Way before my time.
I'm old, but I'm not that old.
Full disclosure, today we will be jumping into the earlier, very beginning aspects of video game consoles. I was not around for that. The Angus being a much more experienced veteran gamer than I will speak from personal experiences more than I will, but I definitely have a lot to talk about myself.
Well-seasoned, long-time vet here, so we'll definitely be going into some of the earlier consoles.
Fun fact of the day, many gamers think that the first console game ever made was the Atari, but guess what? It wasn't. We'll get into that later. But in 1940 at the World Fair, Edward Condon, not Condon, you heard that from me, Condon.
Safety first. You know, he didn't want his computer to get any viruses.
Nope, had a lot of good antivirus software back then, but he developed a computer that simulated the mathematical game called NIM. Now, I don't quite understand the whole rules of the game. I did some research. I guess I'm too stupid to understand it, but the whole point of the game was to be not the last person to get the last matchstick. So if you get the last matchstick, you actually lose. He kind of did this computer simulation of it, and guess what? 9% of the time, the computer won. Sounds a little rigged to me, but definitely a trend that we'll see as we jump into this a little bit more. We'll see that the computers won more so than not. So, yeah.
The odds are stacked against the players, similar to casinos or some other.
That's where they got that idea. Casinos got their idea from gaming.
But again, back in the 50s, video games really started with some early, really basic variations of tic-tac-toe, board games such as checkers, chess. These were mainly used to show off new technology as demos. They were used for research purposes, things like that. Then we kind of get into the really first game created for entertainment, which was titled Tennis for Two. It came out in 1958. It had moving graphics. It was played on an oscillator. Some physicists came up with it, and really that was the first game intended for pure entertainment purposes. So the next game that came out was in 1962. It was called Space War. And it was a simple space combat game. Basically, two human players would go around in space in a dogfight type situation and try to kill each other.
Yeah, and so between 1940 and 1962, there was a lot of these simple games that were made very simple. There's not a whole lot of complexity to them. Game development's still really new. They're still trying to find their footing. So in 1967, the first console was made. If not Atari, what else? The brown box.
Sounds dirty.
Sounds dirty, but it was what it was. It was literally a brown box. And the controllers were even a brown box. It was just all very simple to keep with the concept. This brown box was developed by Ralph Baer, and it was a console. It was the first console that actually attached to a TV set. So it was a console in the sense of the word that we kind of look at it today. Once again, the game that it primarily consisted of, it was two cubes that were chasing each other around the screen. Very simple. It could be programmed to do other play a variety of games such as ping pong, checkers. I think chess may have been involved, a few sports games as well. It also featured a light gun, which we will talk about later with the NES. Not to get into too much detail with that now. Something that was one of my personal favorites. It also had an accessory for the golf game that it had as well. So although it was very primitive game types, it was actually very foreshadowing and alluding of the stuff to come. So it was licensed to Magnavox and sold as the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972.
Right. So the Odyssey comes out. It's really the first. I don't really want to say mainstream, but it was the first one that was really available to homes as a true entertainment system for gaming. Basically, it had 3 dots on the screen. That were black and white. It came with actual overlays, plastic overlays that you would overlay on the screen that would serve different purposes. It could be a map. It could be some kind of background, or intended as a background, things like that. But it did come as the brown box with the controllers. They had 3 knobs on the controllers with 1 button on it that would be your fire button or action button. Whatever was needed in the game at hand. As Tasty mentioned, it did have a light gun that it would use in a few of the games. Yep. It sold 350,000 units, which was pretty impressive for back then. It was discontinued in '75, so it ran about 3 years of good solid gaming there for the consumers. It came out with 28 games. 12 of them were actually included with the console. I mean, if you could imagine buying a new Xbox or a PlayStation today,
you're lucky to get one,
and it having 12 games with it. I mean, that's just unheard of.
I wish they would go back to that. Could you imagine getting an Xbox One with
man.
Halo and all those good games on it? Holy,
that would be nice. That would be nice. So, but some of the games that it had were some sports simulators: tennis, hockey, football. It had a submarine game. It had a game that it called States, which was an educational. So video gaming back then was also geared towards educational at that time. They were trying to work their way in the schools and definitely see what avenues they could take the technology. There was Wipeout, which was a racing game. There was one called Dogfighter, which used the gun, which one human player would actually control the airplane, if you will, and fly around while the other one tried to shoot it down with the gun. So it's a little bit more involved, for the time. I think that was pretty advanced, actually.
If you think about it, a lot of those basic games are really the bare bones of games today. Very, very simple concepts, but it's the underlying fundamental concepts of today's complex games as well.
Right. It definitely set up a foundation and definitely, I would say, paved the way for the future of gaming at that time. Now the 70s brought about a boom of other consoles. We saw several ones. Obviously, the Magnavox was the first. The first of any true merit. Along with that, you also had in '76, you had one called the VES, the Video Entertainment System, which it was actually the first to use cartridges. To use true ROM cartridges. It was the first to use a microprocessor. Ooh. So, again, for the time, I mean, that was something that was very technologically advanced.
And integrating new technologies with this new industry known as the video game industry as well.
Right. And its controller was a little bit different. It actually used a joystick that did not have a base. If you can think of the joystick that for example, the Atari used, which we'll talk about later, but it had the square base with the joystick on top of it. This was just kind of a freestanding joystick. So it actually had the single joystick with a kind of a thumbstick on the top. That the cool thing about that, other than it being the precursor to modern day thumbsticks, is that the thumbstick itself actually acted as the fire button or action button, and not only could it be pushed down, but it could be pushed up as well for another action.
Directional controls.
Yeah, and again, for the time, that was something that nobody had seen before. That was very new. It was very exciting. Something that opened up possibilities that were previously not available. So then we get into some other lesser known consoles. RCA actually entered the console market in '77 with the RCA Studio. It had 5 games built into it. Only 10 games were released. It actually had, instead of controllers, used 10-button keypads that were built onto the console itself. So it was a little bit less traditional than what we see today.
Kind of an odd design if you building the controller on the console.
Definitely, and definitely could have played into its failure. It actually was not successful at all. There was another one in '77 called the Astrocade that was put out by Nutting Associates.
Oh, it sounds messy.
It could have been. And actually Midway was involved with that as well. That's another name you've probably heard. Obviously they were big into NBA Jam and several other popular games.
Midway Nutting.
Yes. So the Astrocade had 28 games. For its time, it had some of the most powerful graphics on the market in the late 70s. So it was definitely good for its time period, but again, couldn't really keep up with what was going on. And that brings us to the main major console of the 70s. The big dog, if you will, the Atari 2600.
Yes, the Atari 2600 was released in 1977. But let's take a couple years back and look at when Atari was actually founded in 1972. As Angus has hinted at, there was a lot of different kinds of consoles made, a lot of different types of games made during the 70s. The one thing that was most prevalent was arcade games. Arcade games dominated the 70s. Atari led that way. And one of the games that we can all remember was Pong.
Absolutely.
Even being born in 1992, I can recall playing Pong myself, whether it was on a Dreamcast, whether it was on a new system, or even current day. Pong is probably one of the most iconic games ever made, and although it's super simple, it was very addicting and people loved it. So, the 70s game industry was dominated by Atari, and as Angus mentioned, it was the leading player during this time. Atari kind of inspired other companies in 1972, and this is when we start seeing these other true video game developers such as Midway actually starting up and starting to crop up, because there's a lot of potential in this ever-growing market. So in 1972, also the Magnavox Odyssey, as mentioned above, goes on sale. So this is when the Magnavox Odyssey actually starts to sell, so does Atari. So at this point we have two major competitors in the game. We will see later who actually wins. And so in 1976, Magnavox releases the Odyssey 300. So at this point, in just 3 years, we've had 3 different versions of the Odyssey. That's one new console update a year. It's a lot better than what we have now, which is the one new console every 4 years. Actually getting a little better about that. But we can see all of this points to the video game industry getting more steam, more momentum, and it's just super exciting. Everyone's excited about this, and it's actually becoming a prevalent industry and foreshadowing what's to come.
Sure. And with the Atari, it came with actually 2 joysticks that, as we kind of mentioned before, it was a square base, a joystick on top with also a button. It also came with 2 paddle controllers, which were kind of more rectangular with a round dial on the top that you could turn and do different things with in the different games, along with a button on the side of that as well. And then it actually came with one game. In the early stages, it came with a game called Combat, which was very interesting for the time. It was tanks. It had tanks in it. It had airplanes. Lots of different fighting between players or the CPU. Obviously, it was definitely more fun to get the second player in there and just lay waste to them whenever possible.
Yeah, and to that point, one thing arcade games actually started to instill was competitive gaming. We'll talk about this a little later, but competitive gaming is an extremely up-and-coming sport. MLG is in current day. It's huge. And if you look all the way back, arcade gaming, all these leaderboards, this all instilled competitiveness within gamers and within players from the beginning. So it's kind of this common theme throughout history that we will see, and we will see the gaming industry enforcing this competitive edge more and more within its gamers.
Right. And with the Atari, we really saw the first true mainstream console.
Yes.
The Atari was selling like crazy. I mean, it was selling like hotcakes.
It was probably one of the first consoles to actually be a common household item. So it was actually a console that was common to be in households.
Yes. It had such great games. It had Pac-Man, Space Invaders. It brought in a lot of the arcade titles, that it licensed in, like Space Invaders, Centipede, Asteroids, things like that. Some of the other great games. It brought in some Star Wars games, Breakout. It just had so many good games, but as with any console, it did have the good with the bad. Everybody knows the story of the ET game,
yes.
which I actually still own a true copy of. It didn't make its way to the landfill, as the famous story mentions.
Where's it at?
It's definitely in the attic.
All right, well, we know where I'm going to be after this video. So, as we've seen, the 70s was huge for gaming. It really is what kick-started the gaming industry from a commercial perspective, a common household perspective. It's really when Atari said, we're going to do this, and just took that leap. So moving into the 80s was a very interesting time. There wasn't a whole lot of major things going on. There was also the 1983 gaming crash, which we will kind of explore why that actually happened. But in the 80s, we did see a lot of the bigger name titles and franchises that we know today actually start to come up. And also, we have a new player in the mix, Nintendo.
Right. As the 70s were kind of going out, like I say, video games were definitely picking up steam. As we mentioned, Atari, they sold 30 million consoles, hundreds of millions copies of games. It had a library of almost 500 games. So it must have been doing very well.
It trumps the Odyssey's 350,000 sold?
Absolutely. So, you're talking about things that are going very well for the video game industry, that it's up and coming and definitely looking well. But then they start to slow down, As the industry starts to pick up and really gain steam, it brings in a lot of people who are trying to make that paper, to get their hand in the cookie jar, if you will.
Yep. Had a little convoluted space. So in 1983, the gaming industry experienced what we would know as the gaming depression. The market just crashed. It was a huge, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say probably a couple $1 billion industry, and then it went down to, I think, 100 million?
I do know the numbers, and so in 1983, it actually kind of closed out with about a $3.8 billion.
That's close.
$billion revenue. By the start of 1985, it had dropped down to just 110 million, which is a 97% drop in interest in the video game industry. So definitely took a heavy hit.
And I believe a common cause of that, or the biggest cause, would be that as we saw in the 70s, so much video games were getting so much steam that people were starting to see the opportunity in this market, and everyone jumped in. So we had a lot of different games, a lot of different game types. The space just became so muddled with options, and then video games just started to lose their steam because there was so many bad things going on that everyone just kind of dropped out.
Right. People just lost their trust and confidence in the video game industry. When you have that many third-party people putting out mediocre or less games, again, we go back to the story of Atari, where it wasn't actually only E.T. They put hundreds of titles in a landfill and literally just buried them because they couldn't sell them. They couldn't move them. And that's because the consumers just did not have faith in the video game industry anymore. They were definitely losing confidence in developers and publishers putting out good, solid titles.
Yes. So with all of this going on, video game industry is losing hope. We have so many different games going in. People are just losing hope. They don't want to play video games. Who's going to be our Jesus? Who's going to be the Savior?
Well, thankfully, Nintendo. Nintendo comes around in 85.
Da, 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 da.
And not only Nintendo, but we also see Sega enter the mix. And as I've mentioned in some of our other videos, with competition and that competitive nature between businesses, where one will have to constantly outdo the other to stay ahead, that always turns into good things for consumers.
Yep.
You get better games, better titles, better consoles, because everybody's wanting to be the best.
Yep. And so in 1985, something happened. A miracle, if you will. Nintendo released the console known as the NES.
Right, and it actually first came out as the Famicom in Japan, and then when they brought it over to the U.S., it was obviously the Nintendo Entertainment System to make it sound a little more friendly to us Americans.
Yes, and Nintendo had already been making a little bit of a splash in Japan, and so when they saw an opportunity that the U.S. gaming market was taking a crash, and they wanted to be our savior. So they jumped in, as Angus said, with the NES. This was the first console that I remember playing. The Dreamcast I have more memories with, but I do recall playing the NES. The Duck Hunt was my personal favorite game. There was Super Mario on that as well. And the Duck Hunt had the light gun that we saw from way back when. It kind of redid it, and it did an awesome job. So it offered a whole different variety of games. It introduced, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the big name titles such as Mario. And fun fact, Mario did not make his first appearance on the NES. He made his first appearance as Jumpman in the arcade game of Donkey Kong. So, fun fact, most people don't know that, but these big names, Zelda, a lot of these big names that Nintendo fan favorites started to come out in the 80s as our savior.
Right. When the NES came to the U.S., they were instantly a powerhouse.
Yep.
They had so many games, so many great games, and a lot of kids today, they don't really know how hard the games were back then. The difficulty level on the NES games were so unbelievably ahead of what games are today. You know, for the most part, there were no save points, there were no checkpoints. You had X number of lives to get through every stage in the game, beat every boss, or else you start over. It was that simple.
Cheat codes?
Cheat codes were in there. Obviously, the NES, you know, had some cheat codes. It also had the game Genie, which we saw, which brought cheating to the traditional gamer in the wide variety. I'm not a fan of that. You know, as you mentioned, the Duck Hunt, the Tasty Nades was known for setting inches away from the screen, blasting those poor.
It's a valid strategy. It's a valid strategy.
It was not. But the NES was a powerhouse. You know, it sold in its lifetime 34 million units. I mean, that's unbelievable. And obviously, we see how much strength it still holds in the market when they released the NES Classic.
Yep.
Those sold out very quickly, and they actually stopped manufacturing them, which I don't agree with. You know, I think there's still lots of demand for those.
You see a lot of kids my generation that have never seen older consoles. They're so used to this Xbox generation with these super advanced functionality, and then you get something like the NES, and as Angus hinted at earlier, they don't realize the level of difficulty. They get this controller with 2 buttons and a little D-pads, and they think that it's amazing. It's so much fun. It's so easy, but yet it's so challenging. And so I think that if they did maybe keep manufacturing some of these older consoles, I think that there could be a kind of a niche market for it.
Absolutely. But, you know, the NES brought with it a library of over 700 games, which, you know, at that time in the industry was kind of unheard of.
Yeah.
You know, that was a very large library, and I would say that a lot of them, or most of them, were very fun games. So with that library, you know, there was tons and tons of fun games. You know, I had a lot of NES games growing up. Probably at one point in my peak, I had about 100, and I would say I loved every one of them. You know, there were so many great games like Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man. Mega Man was always one of my favorites, and one of the reasons is because it was so challenging. You know. And you had Tecmo Bowl, you had RBI Baseball, you had Double Dragons, which was great to play co-op. You know, there were so many good 2-player games. Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers.
Oh, yes, I remember that one.
That was one of my favorites. You know, I would actually pick up my brother and carry him through the level on the parts he couldn't get through. And, you know...
That's me. It's me for those.
Then just to be a jerk, you could always throw him off the side of the map and kill him.
And you would never do that, would you?
Never. So you know, so there's so many good games to mention. You know, I couldn't mention them all, even if I tried. You know, but with the NES, again, we mentioned Sega. That tried to get in there and compete with the Sega Master System that was released in '85 as well. You know, it only sold 2 million units. So when you're looking at 2 million units versus 34. You can definitely see who the front runner is.
Clear leader. Right.
But it had some good games as well. You know, it had Alex Kidd California Games, Outrun. You know, it had Golden Axe. You know, and Sonic actually first came out on the Master System, not on the Genesis. So,
fun fact.
That's where Sonic actually debuted. But it only had a library of a little over 300 games. So a lot less games, a lot less units. You could see it just wasn't doing quite as well.
Yep, Nintendo actually, as we mentioned, it saved us from the crash, so they got in and really shined, and it was hard for people to see past them being so good. And 1989 is when the Sega Genesis actually comes out. So Nintendo had their reign from 85 to 89 with the NES. And the Genesis, I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm most certain they did not necessarily compete with the NES, but it definitely introduced a new emerging player, summing up the 80s and going into the 90s. We had nothing but momentum. The crash happened, we got it over with, and now we're back on the rise again. So let's see what the 90s is going to hold for us.
Right. Well, and, with the Genesis, that brings in the 16-bit market. The new 16-bit technology. It wasn't really a true competitor of the NES. The NES was obviously just an 8-bit. Obviously, the NES was still going strong at that point. It actually didn't officially discontinue until '95. So it definitely had a good run. But along with the Genesis, we see some other consoles try to make their way in. Actually, the first 16-bit console was one called the TurboGrafx 16. You may or may not have heard of. It sold less than 1 million units, only had about 130 games in its library. I can remember as a kid seeing the commercials for it. They, obviously Nintendo had Mario as their mascot. A lot of the up-and-coming consoles tried to do similar things with picking a mascot. The TurboGrafx 16 had a caveman that was called Bonk. Some of you may or may not remember, but I can remember those commercials, and young buck. But they definitely tried to get into that, and they also introduced the first CD capabilities by publishing a CD add-on called the Duo that would attach to the console. But even that wasn't enough to really get enough pull from the industry, from consumers, to keep it alive. Another one that came out around that same time was the Neo Geo. Again, some people may or may not have heard of it. Instead of using a traditional controller, it was more arcade-based, so it had an actual arcade pad with a joystick and the traditional arcade buttons. And it tried to take some of the arcade boom that had happened in the 80s and bring it into the home with the Neo Geo. But unfortunately, it sold less than 1 million worldwide. Had a little over 100 games in its library and just wasn't enough. So that brings us to the two powerhouses that were in the 16-bit era, which was the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo.
Yes, so in the 80s we had arcades still had a strong presence. It was slowly dying out, and we saw moving to the console approach. So they were taking arcade games and putting them in the console, so we kind of get a little bit of a hint that arcade may be going away. So that's something that's huge. And now the 90s, we had nothing but momentum. It says let's take these next-gen consoles. We have the 16-bit graphics. Let's just go all in with this, and let's see what we can make. So in 1990, I do want to mention, I think it's worth mentioning, Microsoft packages Solitaire, the card game, into their OS system. So when you purchase a computer, you get Solitaire. I think that sets up the framework for a lot of things. But it was very
all of us older gamers have definitely spent some time on the clock, on the company dime, playing some Solitaire.
I think one of your personal computers actually had Solitaire on the tower.
Yes, it did.
That's crazy. That's crazy thought. So in 1991, Sonic actually comes out on the Sega Genesis. As Angus mentioned, the mascot was for Nintendo was Mario, and then we start to see Sonic become the mascot for Sega, start to be kind of the face of Sega. And in 1992, 1993, these 2 years is actually when the game rating system come out. The first Mortal Kombat arcade game came out then, and there was a lot of blood, obviously. Also in the 90s, we see Tomb Raider emerge. And this is when a lot of people were saying that video game developers were starting to portray women in a sexually enticing manner. So you see a lot of these controversial things come up. Video game developers are pushing the boundaries of what they can get away with blood and gore, with violence. And with all that going on, it's hard to imagine that was a actual government issue back then, and they came out with the game rating system to kind of counter that and control that. in a lot of different ways. But it's hard to imagine looking at that now. All the games that we have out, adult games, everything else. It's hard to imagine that blood and gore was such a big deal back then.
Right. Well, it was just something that was up until that time really didn't get pushed into the home, didn't get pushed into kids' hands as much. Now you've got children playing these games with all this blood and gore and things, and so obviously people are going to think that there needs to be some kind of mandate, some kind of monitoring, and some kind of system to set up who and who shouldn't be playing these games.
Absolutely.
Obviously for me as a gamer, I want gamers to play as much and everything as they can. But to that extent, also, I can see where there does need to be some kind of system in place as a warning to users who may or may not get offended by whatever content is in the games. So with all these new games with the Sega Genesis, obviously what we've already mentioned was Sonic, which was huge for Sega, brought them in a lot of gamers. Up until that point, a lot of video games were platform-type games, a little bit slower, to where you were jumping, you were dodging, and then you bring Sonic into the mix that is just full on high speed. Just got off some bath salts, just running, non-stop, just hammering down on the gas.
Any more adjectives to describe it?
I could, but that's exactly what Sonic was, and it brought a new level of fun to the games. So you had Sonic with Sega. There was tons of other good games that Sega brought. Phantasy Star, Earthworm Jim. Which we've already mentioned. Some of the Mortal Kombat games were on there, which brought a lot of fun. Broke a lot of love between siblings.
Yep.
Definitely divided homes, I would say.
Yeah.
It definitely divided ours.
Yep.
The Sega ended up selling 14 million copies and ended up with a library of almost 900 games. So again, you have a large library, and this is the first time we really see anybody really try to compete with Nintendo. We didn't see that with the Sega Master System. Obviously, there was a huge gap with the NES and the Master System. But now with the Genesis selling 14 million units and having such a large library, we see true competition with Nintendo.
That's good to see.
Right.
Better games.
Absolutely. So in 91, Nintendo releases the Super Nintendo. So that's their reach into the 16-bit market. But they ended up selling 20 million units. So still definitely outdid Sega, but Sega closed the gap by a large margin.
Keeping it close.
Absolutely. So the Super Nintendo had a library of almost 800 games. That come with it, along with the typical series you would see from Nintendo. More Mario games, more Zelda games, more Metroid, Donkey Kong, all the traditional games you would expect to see from Nintendo.
The start of very long franchises.
Right. And you had some new franchises start: Mario Kart, Mario RPG, several other games that again you would just expect to see from Nintendo. So they brought it hard, like they often do.
Oh yeah, keep with their true bread and butter.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the Sega and Nintendo battle continued and definitely heated up there in the early '90s with the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Again, as the video industry kept growing, more and more companies tried to get into it. We saw some more bad consoles released. The 3DO, Atari actually released the Jaguar. Both of these bombed. Sega, after the Genesis, tried to release an add-on for the Genesis called the 32X, which was to bring the 16-bit console up to 32-bit graphics. They released a few games. It didn't do very well at all. Actually bombed out. One of the games they released was Doom. I can remember playing Doom on the 32X, and really, I wasn't very impressed at the time.
I remember playing Doom. I think it was on the PC.
Could have been. So those bomb. Then after that, Sega actually tries to get into the CD side of video gaming with the Sega Saturn, and unfortunately, that bombed as well.
The CDs are like a ring. The Saturn, it's like rings.
I can see what you did there.
Yeah,
that was quite a stretch.
Maybe that's maybe you think they were thinking that while they made the console, like, what are we gonna call this?
Possibly. So you have these consoles bombing. Meanwhile, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo are still out there. So what's next?
What's next? In 1995, Sony enters the picture with their PlayStation 1. I have a lot of fond memories of this, going over to my cousin's house, playing games like Twisted Metal, just tearing shit up with some cars. Vehicular slaughter all over the place. And in 1996, Nintendo counters that with the release of one of my favorite consoles of all time, the Nintendo 64. This is where Tomb Raider comes out, and of course all the gamers love this interpretation of...
She's an explorer.
Yes.
Let's just leave it at that.
That loves exploring with this explorer known as the Tomb Raider.
She definitely
Lara Croft.
explored my heart.
Yes, but she is no Cortana. I'll make special note of that.
True. So we see a new powerhouse enter the market at this point. Up until now, we had Atari in the beginning. At this point, Atari is really dying out. They're kind of really out of the console game at this point. They're not doing well. So we really just had Nintendo and Sega. Now we enter Sony into the mix with the PlayStation 1. And, man, they really took the ground running. I mean, you talk about a system that sold 102 million units worldwide. They had a library of 2,500 games. I mean, huge.
It trumps everything.
Huge.
Trumps everything.
Yes, it does. So, with that, they bring a new controller that we haven't really seen yet, which is with dual thumbsticks. The N64 tried to do it. It wasn't a true dual thumbstick situation.
Very goofy-looking controller.
Yes,
with the three.
Which we'll get into that in a little bit. But we do see with Sony, with the dual thumbsticks, that brings in a lot of different gameplay possibilities, especially with first-person games. Mm-hmm. It definitely brings in a new aspect to the gaming. And Sony brought a lot of great games, so many great games. Metal Gear, Final Fantasy, Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot to this day has a huge following, almost a cult following. I wouldn't say it's on the level of Mario, but it's pretty close.
Nope.
And then some of my favorite games of the PlayStation, which was the Tony Hawk series.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about those.
The Tony Hawk Pro Skater games were absolutely amazing.
Yes.
I can't tell you how much time I spent doing stuff that there is no way I could do in real life.
The 900, I remember trying to hit that 900 spin.
Yes.
Oh, I forgot all about those.
So we definitely see Sony hit the market and hit it well.
Yep.
They definitely take off running. It's a huge, massive success with the PlayStation 1. As we mentioned, Nintendo is in the mix with the N64. It sold 20 million units in the U.S., so still did very, very well. Continued on with the success that we've seen Nintendo have so far.
And they did what they always did. They made Mario, or what they always do. They stick with their bread and butter, the Mario franchises. They just keep building on that, and it builds these, as you mentioned earlier, these cult-like followings. I remember going to PAX East 2017 this year, and the Nintendo booth was insanely busy at all times. People were... Nintendo fans are Nintendo fans.
Yes,
die hard.
They love it.
Yep.
They love it. And with the N64, we see a new Mario game, as we do with every new console. And this one brings to the mix a 3D world for Mario, which we haven't really seen this up to this point. A true 3D environment. And I'm sure everybody can remember loving Super Mario 64.
Yes, you actually owned that game, did you?
Yes.
I remember playing it.
It was absolutely an outstanding game. You also, with that, bring in new Zelda games, another Mario Kart, Smash Brothers. It follows on with all the titles that you would want to see from Nintendo.
Bread and butter, baby.
So as we mentioned before, the one odd thing about the N64 was the controller. Mm-hmm. It was kind of a three-pronged deal. You had one thumb, or you had the thumbstick on the middle prong towards the bottom.
Is there a proper way to hold it? Do you know?
It depends on what you're playing. The D-pad is on the left. The thumbstick is in the middle. So you have to put your left hand on one or the other. And then, of course, it had the shoulder buttons, all the buttons on the controller itself. So it was kind of odd. It wasn't your traditional controller layout that we'd seen up to this point.
Yes, and the controller layout that was maintained through the years was none other than PlayStations.
True. And you know, with the N64, they actually chose to stay with the cartridge system, where everyone else, such as PlayStation, was trending towards the CD market.
Yes, so we've seen Sega kind of get out of the picture. We've seen Nintendo maintain their bull-like charge, if you will, and now we've seen Sony enter the picture. Sega counters that in 1999 with none other than the Dreamcast. Now, this was a system that I remember a lot growing up, and the Angus played a lot of the NBA games on there. And this was a game where you could actually trash type, not trash talk. You have to pause the game, using a keyboard, type trash talk to your teammate, send it, and then resume the game. I remember this growing up. This was a common trend in our household. This was where the Angus learned his trash talking skills.
Absolutely, the best.
Yes. So looking back, hindsight, the Dreamcast was probably Sega's last little hee-haw before the 2000s kicked in. But it was a good way to go out. And it's definitely a console that I think will go down as a rememberable console.
It had a very short run. I actually love the console. I still own mine today. You know, again, it had a different controller. It was big, kind of bulky. It was something that hadn't really been seen before. It had a slot inside the top to where you could insert a memory card. Or one thing that I really liked about it was it had a kind of a small video screen that you could insert on there. It was very useful in games, football games, things like that, to where you could actually pick your play on the screen on your controller, so that way the other person couldn't really cheat and see what it is that you're picking.
I would never do that, for the record.
So they definitely tried to go away from the norm there, try to bust away from the pack. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it just didn't do well. It had a very short run of 3 years. It ended up only selling about 9 million units, but it did have a quite extensive library in that time, about 600 games. And like I said, I did love several of the games. I can remember playing like Tasty mentioned, the NBA games. You know, this was really my first taste of console gaming online. You know, I can remember it only connected through dial-up, so you'd have to dial into the servers. At that point, there was no online ranking system built into the game, so it used a ladder system to where if you beat somebody, they had to go report that they beat you, or otherwise it really didn't count for any true ranking.
How many people actually reported losses?
Surprisingly, there was more honest people out there than dishonest.
Wow.
Yes, it was quite impressive as far as how well it did. Obviously, it wasn't 100%. There were those people that just would not go report it on there, but it was definitely fun to play online.
And for you young guns, the dial-up, you better hope nobody answers the phone, or you just got a loss on that game.
Right. So definitely, you know, the Dreamcast, it came out. It tried to do some things new and different, but just didn't make it. So the next console we see come into the mix is the PlayStation 2. Here Sony returns on their success of the PlayStation 1, and a huge success. They released the PlayStation 2.
Yes, so the 90s really set the stage for the consoles to come, set the bar in regards to graphics, capabilities, using new technologies, innovating new technologies, rapid growth, all this. Just picked the steam up from the boom of the late 80s and just kept running with it straight into the 2000s. In 2000, the PS2 comes out. So Sony just builds upon their PS1. I actually owned a PS2. It was one of the first consoles that I ever owned. One of the best games that I would say ever made, Need for Speed Underground 2 on the PS2. One of the best games ever made, in my opinion.
I would definitely say it's the best racing game I've ever played in all my years.
Yes.
And that's quite a few.
How many? 20, 30, 40?
We'll
50?
move on.
Yep, sorry. And then in 2001... So, as we mentioned, Sega they pretty much lost out. They still try and stay a player, but not a whole lot. So we have Nintendo and we have Sony. Microsoft, the third demon, enters the realm of competition with their introduction of the first Xbox One. Not the Xbox One, but the first Xbox.
We'll just call it the original Xbox.
The original Xbox, the OX.
I know it's confusing.
The OX, if you will, was introduced. So Microsoft introduces the first Xbox and integrates the online play from Dreamcast. And this is what we really know as the current day Xbox Live. This is what Xbox and really, in my opinion, PlayStation and Nintendo and all those kind of built upon this foundation that Microsoft set. Now, I don't want to say that. I don't enjoy saying that. I don't ever want to give Microsoft credit for anything, but they did set the bar really high and really well with the first Xbox. So at this point, you have the PlayStation 2, the first Xbox, and then Nintendo counters in 2001 with their GameCube.
Right.
So now this is where the big three really get set.
Right. So this brings in the big competition between the three major players of Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft.
Yes.
The PlayStation 2 in its lifetime sold 50 million units in the U.S., so you can see it did very well. It definitely didn't hurt from the competition too much. And with the PlayStation 2, we see another huge, extensive library of games. Another 2,500 games for the PlayStation 2. You can tell that Sony definitely wants to appeal to as many gamers as they can, get as many games out there as they can.
International appeal as well.
Absolutely. So we see another huge library of games: Grand Theft Auto, more Final Fantasy, Metal Gear. We see God of War.
Ooh,
we see Shadow of the Colossus, which I love that game. If you haven't played that, I definitely recommend it. And another great series of mine from that's on PlayStation is Kingdom Hearts.
Ooh,
I love Kingdom Hearts. I'm a big fan of Disney, so to bring that in with the video game is outstanding in my opinion.
Yes, that actually hints at these big name players that aren't in the video game industry actually trying to get into there, because once again, opportunity is present to actually make a profit out of these emerging video game industry, and it's getting more and more popular. History has shown that although it may dip, it's going to come right back. It's not going anywhere. So 2000s, we really start to see these other companies that aren't known for video games try and get into the video game industry, Disney being one of them.
Right. So then, of course, we have the original Xbox, the OX, which sold 24 million units. So still right up there with the PlayStation 2. Not quite as many, but pretty close. It also had a very large library of games, over 1,000 games with the original Xbox.
Halo was introduced.
Yes, Halo and Master Chief was definitely there. And Cortana. But what we see with the Xbox as opposed to the PlayStation is that it's a little bit more bulky. It comes with a very large controller and a very large console itself. It looks like an old school VCR sitting on your shelf. It's just huge. But the controller, actually, they had some issues, especially with younger gamers, where they just really couldn't hold the controller that well. So they definitely had some issues. Some third-party controllers were released to where they made them a little bit smaller, made it a little bit better for gamers.
Good attempt, but not a good attempt.
Right.
Still had the same issues, same big, thick, black controllers.
Yes.
Bulkiness, just
yes.
all in your face.
Yes. But again, with the Xbox, Microsoft comes in, they hit the ground running. They release plenty of great games. There are plenty of great games on the Xbox to be had, and of course they had their main forerunner, which definitely helped carry them, which is Halo.
Yes, Halo is actually one of my personal favorites, and still to this day, Halo 3 is one of my top games ever. And the Halo franchise really kicks off and is still alive today. I don't know if I'd say doing well, but still alive today in one form or the other.
Right. So of course now we have the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, both going with the CD route. They're getting away from the cartridges. So then Nintendo has the GameCube.
I actually own that.
Right. So what do we expect them to do? Up to this point, they've stuck with the cartridge format. Even though with going all the way back to the original Nintendo, we've had the problems with having to give the cartridges a blowjob,
Ooh, had to give it a little blow jizzle.
Yes,
I see what you're saying. Yes.
So to clear the dust, of course.
Yes.
But so the GameCube comes in, it sells 12 million copies, or 12 million units in its life. So it does fairly well at that point. But it also starts to get into the CD market. But what do? They want to be different. So they came out with a little mini CD for the games.
Yes, this was one thing that was I actually didn't like, because you're trying to get it in the console and you couldn't push it down, and the stuff was just smaller. This really, at least looking back, hinted that Nintendo would start doing some really weird things with their consoles.
Yes.
Very innovative thoughts, perhaps, would be maybe the best word for that.
Right. So not only with the disc itself, but also with the console. The console was very small, and obviously it's called a GameCube because it was an actual cube.
Yes.
Imagine that. But it did very well. It had a library of over 600 games. The controllers for the GameCube were a little bit different. They weren't quite as drastic as the N64 controllers, but some of their button placements on there were a little iffy. They had the dual thumbsticks, one in the top left, one in the bottom right of the controller, and the D-pad hanging down the bottom left as well.
It's like they combined the N64 controller with the PlayStation style, the Xbox style, and it was different. It was different. It was better than the N64 controller, but it was still kind of clunky.
Yes. But they push out another great library of games. More Mario, more Smash Brothers, more Zelda. They just keep pushing what the gamers have loved up to this point, and it served them very well. And also with the GameCube, finally, Luigi gets some respect. He gets his own game. Finally. So that kind of takes us out of that area. We get into a little bit more of the modern era now.
Yes, in 2005, Microsoft released the Xbox 360. Now, many of us gamers have owned an Xbox 360. Hopefully we have at least played on one, whether we like it or not. But the impact of the Xbox 360 was that it brought HD, high-definition gaming to gamers. This was a huge move. As we mentioned, the PlayStation 1 had a huge move with graphic improvements. Things are getting more realistic. We want the gaming experience to feel more real. We want to be more immersed. So Microsoft put HD graphics in their Xbox 360, which had some hiccups at the beginning with the red ring of death. But it was a very flawed console in my opinion. But the impact that it had will forever be remembered in regards to the HD gaming.
Right. And with the Xbox 360, along comes the competition of the big three. We also see Sony release the PlayStation 3, and Nintendo release what was innovative at the time, the Wii. It had the motion sensing controllers.
Yes.
And along with the Wii, that again drives competition among the competitors. So we see the PlayStation release the PS Move, which were the magic wands.
Yes.
We also see Xbox release the Kinect to get the body sensing motion capture for their version of interactive gaming.
Yes, and so the Wii, once again, keeping with the trend, did something very different or innovative, depending on how you look at it, and it inspired the other consoles to kind of follow suit and do it in their own way, which maybe makes Nintendo look, once again, kind of different or kind of odd, but really Nintendo set the stage for that, and without that, we may not have interactive gaming as we know it today.
Yes, and also along with this, while the original Xbox and the PlayStation 2 did have some online capabilities, we didn't see anything really widespread and mainstream until the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Now online features are almost demanded in every single game.
If not the majority.
Right. With Xbox, you now get a friends list. You get all the social aspects. And you get that along all three consoles in some fashion or another. But we really see online capabilities and online gaming take a huge leap with this generation of consoles.
And with that comes more competition. We've slowly been driving more. The gaming industry's been pushing competitiveness, whether you look at the split screens, then you go into online play, co-op, all this kind of stuff. It's just driving competition, and gamers are getting more and more competitive with each other. And I have a feeling we're going to start to see more tournaments come along.
I could see that. Along with the online gaming, you definitely saw a rise in the MLG, the esports. the professional side of gaming
Yes.
definitely took a turn for the better with all this new technology and capabilities that are being released in the new consoles.
Yes, so we have all this new innovation, interactive experiences. So we take all of this and then we move to a new device called the mobile phone, the telephone. So now there's been a whole new, I wouldn't say player, but a whole new platform thrown in the mix that we now live on. We live on our mobile phone. So in 2009, this is when the mobile gaming, Angry Birds, Farmville, all those different types of games that are on our phone that we can't imagine life without now, that's when all that really starts to kick off.
Right. You know, we definitely see the mobile phone almost become a console itself.
Yep.
And definitely expand from there. So you know, with the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, and the Wii, we see another great library of games across all three. We definitely with the Wii, we see some things we haven't seen before. With the Xbox 360 Connect and the PS Move, we see some things that we haven't seen before. This is all trending towards more interactive gaming. That really leads up to VR later down the road.
Yes, and gaming industries want us to be more social, so they're pushing, as Angus mentioned, the online play of things with our mobile phones, interacting with other players. So all this is kind of blending together. Now, one thing that I may be jumping ahead here, but I wish there would be some more cross-platform stuff going on. Maybe we can get some more diehard fans. Might be some interesting lobby conversations going on in there if a PlayStation gamer and Xbox gamer was to play together. That would be an interesting conversation. But yeah, so we saw them. So we see mobile gaming becoming more and more popular every year since 2009. So if we were to look at 2010 to current, if you look at 2012, the Wii U comes out, and also the Kickstarter site emerges. The impact of this is that these indie games, these indie developers now have a very popular platform to use to gain funds for their site, for their game. And the importance of indie games is introducing new concepts, innovative ideas. All this stuff is leading to more and more innovation, more and more creativity. Because there's a lot of these game ideas have already been expunged. A lot of these game concepts are just getting redone in different ways. So to keep it spicy, we need those indie games. So we thank Kickstarter for that. So let's talk about 2010 to current.
Right. So you know, that kind of brings us into the present. You know, what's out there today, which is the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, the Wii U. The Wii U actually came out as a brief competitor to them, but obviously now we have the Nintendo Switch, which is definitely more towards the future, in my opinion. You know, being able to get into that mobile gaming of breaching the gap of home consoles and mobiles,
Taking your games with you.
Absolutely. You know, anywhere you want to go, whether you got to go sit on the pot, you know, instead of scrolling through Facebook, now you can beat a level in Zelda
Or Mario.
You know.
Yes, save Peach from Bowser.
Yes.
As we have done throughout the years.
Right. And then you can pause when you need to wipe and
No.
go back to your TV when you're done.
I mean, I think you can one-handed wipe and also play.
I would not recommend that at all.
I would. Just takes experience. That's all you need. So we've seen a lot of these consoles, like you said, the Xbox One S, a lot of these newer age consoles. The question that may get brought up now is, what does the future hold? We've seen MLG and competitive gaming is at its peak right now. It's doing better than it ever has, and I don't see that dying down at all. We see a lot of these games that are kind of free to play, especially on our phones, or we see like RuneScape or these PC games, whatever the case may be. We see those also being a lot more prevalent with these pay-to-play features. So what's next? We see a lot of these major advancements, a lot of these kind of consoles in between the major ones. Those include like the Xbox One S, the PS4 Slim, the PS4 Pro. All these that kind of give small features, small advances. But also give us just enough to purchase a new console, so maybe it's kind of a money cipher. But we're seeing all these newer consoles. What's next? A lot of these ideas have been expunged. What's next?
Right. To me, it's definitely taking a trend toward the VR space. PlayStation is already headed that way with the PlayStation VR.
Yep.
And then, of course, just the VR itself with the PC world. You know, gamers are wanting to be more interactive, to be more immersed, feel more in control, more like they're actually in the game. So to me, it's definitely trending towards the VR space at the moment.
Yes, so with VR becoming kind of the next step, I do think it's a little ways out from being actually in the consumer market. We saw that with our experiences with VR. It's still very, very young, but as we see these young ideas become the norm in 10 years, maybe even less with the rate of technological growth. But the next step is 4K. 4K is becoming more popular and becoming more realistic for consumers to actually get, whether it's on their TV, computers, gaming consoles, all this stuff. We see that with the Xbox One S. That's coming out on November 7th, 2017, and that will actually support 4K. So as long as you have a TV that supports it and get the games that obviously are in 4K, you're going to have the most realistic, immersive experience, which is what people want out of VR, a very immersive experience. And so it's just getting more and more toward blurring the lines of reality and gaming.
Right.
So we'll see how far that line gets pushed in the coming years.
Right. You know, gaming definitely wants to get as real as possible. So we'll see where that goes. But that's kind of the history of consoles in a nutshell. The past, present, and a touch of the future. Obviously, we don't know what the future holds. That would be a good gift to have. But we hope you enjoyed the video. Check us out on Facebook for video game reviews, posts, and more videos to come. This is a video in a series that we'll be talking about the history of gaming, so look out for more on our YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to us there. Check us out on Instagram. And until next time,
Stay satisfied.